welcome everybody. I'd like to call the Board Education and Business Committee meeting to order for Thursday, April 22nd. We respectfully acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people, where we live, learn, and play. First item is the adoption of the agenda. The agenda is before you, moved by Trustee DeGroot, seconded by Trustee Spilsbury, because I can't see Trustee Thorne. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. I think this is Jason's show tonight. It's all yours, Jason? Budget survey results, or is somebody else sharing that?
I've just invited Mike Russell. He will present the budget survey results prior to my presentation.
Welcome, Mr. Russell.
Good afternoon, trustees. Thank you for having me on. I'd like to share my screen and then run through the 2021-22 public consultation budget process with you. So I'll go ahead and do that. All right, everybody should be seeing my screen, which has our results on it here. So our survey was active for the last 12 days, I believe it was. And we have a total of 136 respondents, which is up from last year of 108 respondents. So last year we were kind of in the thick of the pandemic, but we're still seeing those numbers drop from that high we had in 19 and 20, which was 575 respondents. So one day we will get back there, but it was not this year. So far what we've had is for our respondents, most in this question here, where you can identify your involvement with the school district, you could select whichever box you identified with, and you could select more than one box. So we can see that most people identified as staff members, with second being parent or grandparent or guardian, and that was right in there. Not a lot of involvement from students, although they did know the survey was up and it was discussed at DPAC as well.
Mr. Russell?
Yes.
Can I just, I don't understand these numbers. How can you have 78% of the respondents being staff, and yet there's 45% of the respondents being parent or guardian?
Correct, because you can identify as both. So you could click off staff and a parent if you're in there.
Okay.
So it's not a one or the other. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So this survey, again, like last year's, was framed around our strategic plan and talking about how we're going to resource our plan and which items that the community thought were most important to go with. So on the left-hand side of your screen, this first one was about learning. And the three topics we asked folks is to rate which one they felt was most important, enhancing early learning opportunities and partnerships, focusing on foundational learning, literacy and numeracy, and focusing on applied learning and authentic real-world learning experiences. And as we can see, those last two came in very close together, focusing on authentic real-world learning experiences and literacy and numeracy. When we move over, we go to our Indigenous ways of knowing. And so this one, there's 4 topics in it. So critically examining our own biases, attitudes, beliefs, and values and practices to facilitate truth and reconciliation. Addressing the inequalities of outcomes for our Indigenous learners, creating safe, flexible, and culturally responsive learning environments, and then deepening our understanding of environmental stewardship, place-based historical knowledge, language, and culture. And we see that most people preferred to invest in creating safe, flexible, and culturally responsive learning environments. Moving down, we're on culture of care on the left-hand side here. So we're asking them again to rate. Number one is, we're trying to acquire a deep understanding of our learners by developing healthy relationships, creating healthy work and school environments that promote wellness, enhancing mental health opportunities and partnerships that support well-being. We're continuing to create and promote safe and inclusive learning environments for our diverse communities. As we can see, those last 3 came in very closely together. And finally, the last one was about our future focus system. So the first one was ensuring all our operational plans and procedures are cohesive and aligned with the strategic direction of the district. The second is that all decisions are evidence-based, child-focused, and culturally and environmentally responsive. And the third was continuing to enhance the capacity of the system where all the members of our organization are committed to our primary purpose of supporting our learners. So again, we saw that folks are looking for the evidence-based, child-focused, and culturally responsive environments.
Mike, we have a question from Trustee Spilsbury.
Oh, sorry.
I think you may have just reiterated it, but I wanted you to repeat number 2, the one that's most elected.
Sure, I can do that again. It's that all decisions are evidence-based, child-focused, and culturally and environmentally responsive.
Thank you.
And Trustee Thorne, I see your hand up there, your virtual hand. Did you have a question?
Just a comment. In talking with a lot of my elders, there are some older than me, we sort of got together and said we prefer to think of it as truth to reconciliation instead of truth and reconciliation. Just thought that's it.
Thank you. That goes hand in hand with the teaching we're hearing from our knowledge keepers in our Indigenous Education Department and what they're trying to teach through the district. So the final part here is the section with comments. So we had 136 respondents, 65 people left comments on the survey because there's an optional place for that. Of those, so I've gone through all of them and kind of tallied them up. Of those, 23 of them have to do with services for students and support for students and hoping to increase or not reduce that. There is also mention of custodial, increasing or keeping what we have during the time of COVID. And then I think our survey got caught up a little bit in the hubbub down in Victoria because a lot of people were commenting about not cutting our arts or music programs. So there's a hope for that as well. I will send the survey out to all the trustees and you can go through the comments as you wish. If you have any more questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Any questions, Mr. Russell, at this time? Thank you, sir. Appreciate your work.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think I'm just going to allow Mike to move back to the gallery. So just one moment. I have a presentation to walk through the board on how the budget has evolved from last week to this week. We have had some new learnings around some of our expenditures and reflected those in updated estimates. And we will also go into a couple of the special purpose funds. So I'm going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint and begin by walking through that. So 1 second. So everybody should see a complete slide, introductory slide to today's meeting. And I think you do because I see it on mine. Oops, close. So I just want to begin with this, the same acknowledgement that I am zooming on this meeting from the traditional territories. I'm grateful to be zooming from the traditional territories of the Quetzin peoples. And onto our presentation. So begin by grounding the work that we're doing in our 2021-2022 budget guiding principles. And I know that we've been through these a couple of times, but it's always good to review them at the start of our budget presentations. And so in summary, as we have gone through them a few times, we're really looking to ensure that the priorities of the strategic plan are being considered. And as we move into the next round of the budget, next week, we will begin to align the strategic plan to the budget options. So show you how the budget options either support that. We also want to make sure that we have a transparent process that has public and partner input. And we have had a public meeting now and have a full day tomorrow, full afternoon tomorrow with the partners for input. And we've had advisory committee. And then when it's all over at the end, we need to be able to report those budget decisions back to everybody. And of course, stay within the School Act and balance the budget while maintaining an appropriate contingency balance to support the board's surplus policy. And then again, looking at the 4 priorities, which I will tie into our budget options too in the next presentation, remembering that we're here for learning, Indigenous ways of knowing, culture of care, and future focused systems. And so, to date, the board has done a fair bit of work, but this week is the heavy lifting. The board has established the 2021-2022 budget guiding principles that we just reviewed. They have been considering the priorities of the strategic plan as we discuss the options, to balance the budget. There's been a survey that has was shown by the Director of Communications with 136 responses. Budget options were reviewed with advisory committee and feedback was received. There was a public consultation meeting, which unfortunately didn't collect any feedback, but we did hold the meeting for attendees. And you're continuing to receive information from staff over the past board education and business committee meetings and at the regular board meetings. So the last thing where we were last time with BEBC, April 13th, you considered some of the COVID-19 considerations for the next school year, the contents of the opening budget position, and there was a list of options for consideration. So at this meeting, I'm going to review a list of revised options. I'm going to invite trustees for feedback on those. So if something needs to come off the list or come onto the list, we would like to receive some feedback on that now, and then review the two primary special purpose funds, which will be the Classroom Enhancement Fund and Community Lake, and in particular, the Classroom Enhancement Fund overhead component. So we'll still always need to be remembering that next year won't be 100%, likely 100% normal. We're being kind of told that it would be like a stage 1.1 or just stage 1 point something. We're currently in stage 2, which has the cohort model for students and significant health and safety protocols. The ministry still hasn't been able to provide us what that direction might be for next year or whether there'll be any additional funding. So in this budget, the board may wish to contemplate maintaining some of those practices from the prior year. And so we have that in our options. And there still are some unknowns. The benefit rates for teachers and principals, still unknown. However, we do now know that there is a surplus in those funds, in that fund, as well as there is one in the QP and USW fund. So when you see the next set of options, you're going to see that I've increased that amount. And we never truly know our surplus until the end of the year. Things can happen, but the closer we get to the end of the year, the more confident we are in our year-end balances. There's less that can go wrong. And so I still feel confident in the surplus balance that was presented last time. We still don't know if there's going to be any provincial or federal government support. That hasn't been announced publicly. At least I haven't heard of anything publicly so far in regards to maintaining any of those additional supports for next year. And there's the question of how many students return to in-class instruction in September versus choosing to continue on, as we had a shift from in-class to distributed learning and virtual classroom, and some of those families wish to continue that. We know that international student program revenues and expenditures are significantly affected still, and we'll see an adjustment there. That custodial requirements may still be required for next year. I just talked about surplus estimates being impacted by COVID this current year. And I keep coming back to, nobody traveled, so that's a budget that isn't spent. Investment revenues have been affected. Enrollment estimates are affected for the first time in 6 years. We're anticipating an enrollment drop. And of course, that then impacts staffing levels. And then there's the programs of choice that are being offered for next year. So what is currently in the operating budget expenditures? I know these slides are kind of hard to see. I wish we had the big screen. I did try to split it onto 2 pages, but I wanted to give you an idea, and we can post this to our website, of how many positions we have in each one of these categories as the starting place. So none of these positions reflect any adjustments that are being proposed for declining enrollment, et cetera. So you can get an idea there of that there's 856 FTE that we currently have in the budget for 62.5 million, and our replacement costs are just under 4.1 million. And then moving on, to support all those employees, we have about $15.6 million worth of benefits, and that will come down because we do have those benefit premium holidays. And then you can see where the $8.6 million worth of services and supplies are broken up over. So we're still continuing to support dual credit programs with VIU, which makes up a good portion of the services. So that's why you see a lot of tuition is in that number, the 3.13 million. Student transportation, a lot of that is related to the transportation agreement that the board has with Cowichan tribes. Professional development and travel, some of that is contractual per the teachers collective agreement and the principals agreement, and other portions of that are more discretionary, and we'll put a proposal in on a reduction there. Rentals and leases, we don't have a lot, but we do rent some space. For example, Providence Farm is included in there. Dues and fees includes things such as registration, professional fees for individuals, and the board's enrollment in the BC School Trustees Association. Insurance is the vehicle fleet and maintaining our insurance premiums with School Protection Branch, and there is a contingency in there, and we do run about a $30,000 contingency in that account. As you know, we had 2 fires at Chemainus. We had other instances. I think we had a fire at Lake Cowichan, and we had some break-ins, and so that can go pretty quickly if you have a couple of insurance claims, so $10,000 a deductible. Our supply allocations remain consistent as to the per pupil rate that we provide to each school, and the amounts that are going into each of our departments. Utilities, we've made a modest adjustment to, as we know that there's some anticipated increases in those rates. And then that furniture program, that is the 21st Century Learning Program that the board put in place based on input from students a couple of years ago. And we paused on that this year, partly just simply because of the pandemic and being cautious around expenditures and not spending what necessarily didn't have to be spent, as to protect the ability to adjust if there were any cost pressures that came our way. But it still remains there, and it was very well subscribed, and there are some pretty interesting classrooms now in the school district from that fund. And then we had operating capital, and that was the software program that we've talked about. So this is kind of how the big pie is distributed, and wanted the board to be aware of that at a higher level. And just coming back to this slide, which you've seen before. So the opening budget shortfall started at just under 4.1 million, and we keep talking about the reasons for it. And the main one being that last year we balanced on this year, I shouldn't say last year, this year that we're in, last budget year. We balanced that on 2.5 million of surplus. We believe we're short funded on our teachers and support staff wage increases, and then just an enrollment drop has corresponding reduction in revenue. So here's some new options, and I'll walk through this, and then I'll stop sharing to see if there's any questions on these. So I do have 2 pages of them, and I'll pull the share off in case the trustees want to talk about any of them at this time. So I continue to propose appropriation of the 2020-21 surplus of $2 million. So we have shown you a surplus estimate for this year of 2.083. And I think that is fairly safe. The enrollment, since we last, estimates for our international student program have had a modest adjustment since we last met. There are more registrations that have come in. And it will say that if they're not met, there are still some contingencies in that program, I think, that can accommodate a drop in that revenue. And I've reduced this number. We originally we had a number of about 135 students in the DLVC, the District Distance Learning Virtual Classroom. I've dropped that to 100. We're learning a little bit more about the number of students choosing that program versus the number of students that were in that program now going back to their school. So I think that reduction that I had previously at over $200,000 can now be reduced, that revenue reduction for students being funded at 80% of the full rate. So that's a little bit helpful. Over the last time, we showed you some options on the revenue side. And then looking at expenditure reductions. The last time you saw this, it was $161,428 for benefit premium holiday. We now have the teacher number that's coming out of the premium savings for nobody being able to go to the dentist in March, April, May, and June. So that number I have updated. And we know we need to recognize that that's a one-time savings. So next year that won't be there. But it is there now, and it will, and we have to use it. We have to use it in the next year. So I think that's a little bit of the effects that COVID has had on our budget, and I don't want to say any of it's been positive, but from a financial perspective, we wouldn't normally have that kind of premium holiday because we usually, our insurers are pretty accurate on charging the premium for the service. And this number's gone up, and I'm going to go into this in more detail with trustees a little bit later, but for the purposes of this presentation, I don't want to necessarily talk about what's in this number and create any job fear, but with declining numbers of students, there are areas where there can be some corresponding staffing reduction. So I think I'll leave that part there, but that number has gone up by about $300,000 and is currently proposed quite equitably. And then talking about funding the software upgrade from local capital, which is, we know this year is $150,000. It's a big bill, but it's something that we need to do to move from software that was developed 20 years ago to software that is current and meets the business needs and will allow us to automate and hopefully take pressure off some of the areas of our business function. The local capital account currently has $600,000 in it. So to utilize $150,000 leaves $450,000. And with the amount of surplus properties that are being currently considered for disposal, that will be very adequately replenished in the near future. And we're looking at travel. So one of the things we've learned is a lot more meetings are probably going to happen in the future over Zoom versus people traveling out of district. And so we think that of that $600,000 professional development and travel budget, that we can look to find $50,000 in the next year. So wanted that to be highlighted. That is a new item from the last time that we've added as a savings. Average teacher salary adjustment remains the same. I've explained this many times. We roll everybody over, we give them all the raises and the increments, but then we know people leave and are replaced by less expensive teachers throughout the year. It's just naturally happens in a work group that has a flexible salary structure. So that's $2.065 million worth of options. So we can actually get pretty close to balancing with that, short about 57,000, but there's some things to be added. I know there's some other important things. Looking at the survey and seeing the public and employee groups that were the main responding groups support mental health. I think that the continuation of that LifeSpeak subscription, especially into next year, is important. It's very well utilized, and we should put aside some money to continue with that. And that aligns well with the culture of care in the strategic plan. The district principle of literacy, still talking about funding that from in-service dollars. So this year, those are accounts I haven't brought into the surplus estimate yet. Partly because I felt that the likelihood of them being committed for this purpose was quite high. So the surplus of $2.083 million doesn't include the surplus from those in-service budgets when people weren't able to get together this year and utilize those funds. And then this number I've increased. So, and I should have probably put a slash in it because it's not just the electrostatic sprayer, but it's also ensuring that it was brought to my attention that we should also have all of the supply allocations that would typically go with that program, or go with just in general that overall safe school, clean environment programs such as hand sanitizers and soaps, and then the actual disinfectants. So I bumped it from the 2 sprayer only, the 2 wage accounts, to include another $70,000 for to maintain that hand sanitizers and those portable wash stations and etc.
Jason, why do we not share or show the in-service surplus?
Because I guess, why didn't I put it in the projection? Is that the question? Or why is it not in this?
Well, yes. Yeah, why isn't it, if it's part of our surplus, why isn't it shown in the surplus section? And then this district principal literacy is a number that's
I could have done it that way too. I guess you're right. It could have been a revenue item and an expense item instead of a net zero. For clarity, I can do that. I'll do that in the next presentation.
Okay,
So
thank
that
you.
those two line items appear, because this is a $166,000 item, and you are right, it is missing. And I was thinking of it from the net impact on the budget, and the two things netting themselves out, but I will put it in one column and in the next column, and I'll actually have this laid out completely differently next time, so that looks a little clearer.
Thank you.
So thank you for the recommendation. And then moving into the principal, vice principals, there's been no approval or authority from government yet that would permit any adjustments to those work groups for next year. But we would anticipate that that authority would be similar to what the teachers and QP are receiving, which are contracts that expire next year. And we know that those groups are receiving 2%. And that would be, this is what that would cost to build it into the budget. And then we now have a number for the inclusive education equipment requests. So this used to be a fund where the province, and I'm thinking this is probably over 10 years old, the last time the province actually gave school boards money for inclusive education equipment. And we have frugally managed those budgets over the years to stretch that all the way for a decade to today. But it's run out, and there's needs in the inclusive education department to begin to make some adjustments to their older equipment to service the students. So I think that one fits very nicely under culture of care. Strategic planning. Last year, this number was $75,000, and I realized that the district principal of literacy is also a really big part of that strategic planning. You know, putting funding behind that learning initiative, and that position should likely affect all four of the board's goals of strategic planning and culture of care and Indigenous ways of knowing and future focused systems, but suggesting that another $50,000 be parked in the budget for the balance of that work. I should change that title to strategic plan implementation. So sorry, I shouldn't have had it as strategic planning. And then the final item that we have here is the visiting of the closure week and the capacity for the board to permit their workers, both QP and USW, who are off that week, to bank time so that they can be paid regularly for that work. So if the way this would work would be that, for instance, it might be 12 minutes a day that a QP member needs to work to accumulate enough hours to match their assignment. And then that assignment would be, that week would be paid out during the closure week so that the individuals wouldn't be in layoff. So that has a cost of about $384,000. And so after all of that, we're closer than last time. You know, that now that's about $911,000 short. There can be more expiration into access of the surplus for some of those areas that are priorities as well. But just wanted to give you an idea of how we're beginning to close in on a balanced budget with these recommendations. And I'll stop sharing because this might be an opportunity for questions.
Thank you. Trustees, any questions of Jason at this time? Trustee Thorne.
I have major concerns with what we're not getting from province this year, and maybe even not next, with wage increase, with the things we're looking at. You know, I'm very, very leery about our budgeting, if not for this year, but for next year. I have some major concerns with how and what we should be really concentrating on as priorities. And I don't know if I'm making any sense, but looking at what I've been reading, I don't want to start losing classes. You know, we're making projections with estimates rather than actuals for student enrollment. So many changes. We haven't really given consideration to the private schools where they come into the public school system, what kind of adjustments we can make. That's it. I know it probably doesn't make any sense, but I'm just saying I'm very nervous.
Okay, Trustee Thorne, I'm not sure if there's a question there. I appreciate the concerns. Jason, did you?
Mostly a comment of warning to all of us that we've got to really, really prioritize what we're doing because of what's happening in other districts where they're having to cut classes. They can't meet their school budgets. I don't want to be one of those districts.
Thank you. Trustee Spilsbury? Your mic is not on, Trustee Spilsbury.
I was just going to say I saw the Secretary Treasurer's hand go up at the same time as mine, and he may have some clarification on Trustee Thorne's description.
Thank you. Jason?
Thank you. Well, I think what Trustee Thorne, I believe, I was hearing that he was identifying risk in the budget, risk of not knowing exactly how many students you're going to have and having to make decisions today based on those risk factors. And I think we try to balance that in our approach to our budget. We try to provide trustees with as up-to-date information as we have on our year-end projections, ensure that there's protection of the contingency. So if something doesn't go the way we think it's going to go, that you have that basis in the bank. We try not to be too conservative. We could have been extremely conservative on our enrollment. We are down 400 FTE between September and February, but we're estimating 187 down. So it's a balance of those risks and finding that right spot, because if you cut too much, there's the risk of that loss to their system. Loss of those employees, loss of those individuals, loss of learning. But if you don't manage it properly, then you move into you don't have the money to operate in the manner for which you need to. So it is a bit of a juggling act, and risk is always at the forefront. That what we're providing is as close as we can get without a crystal ball.
Thank you. Trustee Spilsbury?
I'd like to put a motion forward, and it reads that BEBC recommend to the board that a letter be sent to the Minister of Education regarding fully funding labor settlements. If there's someone who would second that.
Trustee Thorne is seconding that. Any discussion on that? Calling the question. Thank you, Trustee Spilsbury. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Trustee Kemley, you had your hand up?
I did. Jason, could you just remind me how much of our contingency do we have left after we've taken the $2 million out?
I can. When I last reported to you, it was about 1.5 million, or approximately 1.7%. And a way to, I think when I was explaining it at the public meeting, if we're operating on an $88 million budget, and this is just a really simple way that we always put it. I know you've heard this many times. You take the 3 zeros off and put it in a context of a household of 88,000, which is a possible household. I don't assume that all households are that, but people can understand that. That would be a $1,500 contingency. So, and that'd be your life savings, actually, because that's the reserve.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I can return to the presentation.
Yes, please. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. Share back to where I was. Okay, so I'm moving on. I think it's time to get into a little bit more detail on the Cost of Enhancement Fund overhead and Community Link, as there are two most significant. Well, AFG is a significant plan, but that plan comes later to the board after all the capital requirements have been analyzed, and that will come around the end of May. But for now, I think these are two of the most significant funds that are important to the board. Where is the Community Link money spent, and where is the Cost of Enhancement Fund overhead spent? And the Cost of Enhancement Fund, we all know what it is now because it's been around since the fall of 2016, when the collective agreement language for teachers was restored, well, between teachers and the board was restored back to 2002 language. And it had an impact, a financial impact, and that impact was threefold. The first part is that we needed to hire many more teachers. And that number last year is about 78 teachers, which is great. Those are teachers we wouldn't have had in our system without this restoration. And the second part of that is when we can't accommodate the class size and compositional language, there's remedy. And so those two, the ministry funds, based on actuals. What do you actually spend in those areas? And then the third part of this is called the overhead, because there's costs associated with managing all that. And that isn't based on a per pupil factor. It's based on how successful we were at the time of demonstrating to the ministry that we had these pressures. So we all have different things in our overhead based on those applications. And in ours, the number remains the same. So what we had last year is the same amount as what we're going to receive. I should say last year. What we had this year is the same as what we're going to receive for next year, $877,000. So that's good. We know that, and we can plan around how best to allocate those. And so what we were looking at here is sort of this fund over the last 4 years. So the 3-year budgets of the last 3 years, we went from 988,000 to 877,000. So we weren't feeling very good about that last year when they made that reduction. And what the big change that came in here is we pivoted some of the money that was going to education assistance to support in the human resources department. And that support needed to be there to plan and track the remedy and deal with the increased pressures in HR of an additional 78 teachers and a few QP members that are funded for here, and fund for leave replacement. So we're not proposing really anything significant other than we late started that position. So we have a little bit more wages here under human resources support. It didn't start on July 1st when this new position was hired. And you might wonder why the EA number is lower, but not significantly lower in a year they got wage increases, but roughly the same amount. And that is because we've tightened up a bit on our calendar scheduling. So I mentioned to you that the number of weeks that employees take is built into our vacation is built into our estimated weeks that we're going to pay somebody. And part of the reason we have a surplus this year is we believe we had too many weeks in our budget. And so we've made those changes. But otherwise, we're proposing that fund remain relatively the same. Still supporting education assistance and keeping that human resource support in place. The balance is really contractual to a point. As we have 78 teachers, they're going to be off and need to be replaced. And that is an expense of this fund. I wish it was an expense of the other fund. And then in-service. So contractually, one of the restored items is that in-service is provided if there is a student with a designation in a classroom. So that is in-service that we need to put in place. And then Pro-D fund, that ties directly to the wages of those teachers. So I don't know, I'll just stop sharing and see if there's any questions because we haven't reviewed this yet this year.
Sorry, Jason, can you go back to that slide? Could you just explain the education assistance change?
Yeah, I can. So it doesn't look like a significant FTE change, but the cost is less. And I think that's what I'm trying to explain here. Let's say we have 39 weeks in a school year. And some years we have 40 weeks in a school year. And in a short school year, one that starts September 8th and potentially ends on June 24th, maybe that's a 39-week school year, not a 40-week school year. So we had an extra week in there due to our calendar. And next year is also a shorter calendar.
Okay, I got it. Sorry.
And so,
I didn't quite understand
but there's also the component of how much vacation does somebody have? Because you're going to be able to take your holidays into the next year. And if you're an employee with a lot of service, you might have 5 weeks accumulated. If you're an employee who's new, you might have 3 weeks accumulated. And so managing that right number to add on to the back end of that 40 weeks or that 39 weeks is how we budget. I hope that makes some clarity.
Thank you.
Okay. So we made adjustments throughout the system to more accurately reflect our EA wages, because that's, I think, one of the reasons why we're surplusing in that account this year. And then we can look at Community Link. So last year, there were some significant changes to the way the Community Link funds were allocated. The amount was about, well, we'll get to the amount because I have another slide for that. But next year, it's $681,913. It's up a bit. It has been supporting areas of student need in school meal programs and community schools. And last year's budget, the following changes were implemented. There was a phased reduction of funding for the community school component. We looked to reduce the positions in support of the food program to then pivot more of those funds to the food program. It actually ended up being quite minor. It wasn't as significant as we had originally gone in due to the realization that the proposal wasn't operationally going to work out the way it was intended. And then the whole point of this was to try to increase the food budget as much as possible so as much of this money went to supporting those students' nutritional needs. And then there was a plan to consider allocating some of these funds to support youth support workers in future years. So we still can kind of continue on with these recommendations. The youth support worker idea has not been reflected in here yet. But if we look at this budget, and I don't know if I've probably too far over for you if you've got your bar on the side like I do. Oops, nope, not gonna work that way. Hang on.
No, we can read that, okay.
Okay, thank you. I wasn't sure if it was fully visible. The only real change that's being reflected here is a shift of the dollars, continuing that 1/3 reduction into the community school component to then shift those dollars into the food element. So this would see the food budget going from 123,000 to 148,000, still providing those student support workers for the social, emotional, and behavior supports, and still providing staffing to deliver those food programs. And there's also an early learning component. So there's no changes there other than, again, we're talking about this, why is it down slightly when there's a wage increase, and that's just really around those weeks adjustments that I was just speaking of with Kitty. So that is what would be proposed in the community link budget for next year so far at this phase in the budget development.
Any questions of Jason?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. So going back to my share screen. Click it here. Okay, so it is starting to wrap up. There's a lot more feedback for the board to receive. The partner groups will be presenting tomorrow, all afternoon, actually, and I'm looking forward to hearing from each of those groups as I get to be a witness to those conversations between the board and the partners. We're hoping that after that, over the weekend, to get together some final recommendations that we can bring to the regular board education and business committee meeting next Tuesday. And when we leave that meeting, if there is a balanced budget, if their board are at the place that they're comfortable with the recommendations and how this budget can be balanced, they can forward that to themselves for consideration on May the 4th. The board does have until June 30th to fully adopt the budget. However, a commitment needs to be made around the staffing level, so that process can continue. So even if the budget isn't adopted, we need to be able to lock down that staffing because those are collective agreement-based timelines. And that was what I had for the board this evening. And I will stop my share and see if there's any more comments or questions.
Thank you, Jason. Trustees, any questions or comments at this time? You explain it well, Jason. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So is there any other business?
I have nothing further to present this evening, Chair.
Okay, so we'll see everybody tomorrow. Can I have a motion to adjourn, please? Trustee DeGroot, Trustee Kemmler, your hand was up, holding your head up.
Yeah.
All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Good night, everyone.